The sound came first, sharp, not loud but precise, like glass settling on marble, and in that instant every conversation in the restaurant dissolved into a silence so complete it felt rehearsed, as if the room itself had been waiting for something to break before anyone understood why. And in the center of it all stood Nia Brooks, her hands still suspended in the air, her breath caught somewhere between fear and defiance, while Charlotte Whitmore, the woman, everyone recognized, the woman draped in silk and quiet authority, turned her face slowly back toward her, eyes wide, not with pain but with disbelief, the kind reserved for moments that simply were not supposed to happen, not here, not to her, not in a place where power had a reserved table and dignity was expected to wait outside with the rest of the staff. And for a fraction of a second no one moved. Forks hovered midair, wine glasses paused inches from lips, and even the low hum of jazz from the corner pianist seemed to falter, as if the music itself had witnessed something it did not know how to continue from. And then the whispers began, soft at first, barely more than breath passing between strangers. Did she just? What just happened? Is that who I think it is? And the questions rippled outward through linen and crystal, through tailored suits and quiet wealth, until every pair of eyes in the room found its way back to the same impossible scene: a waitress in a simple black uniform standing her ground in front of a woman who represented everything she was not supposed to challenge. And for those watching it felt wrong, not just unexpected but wrong, like gravity had shifted without permission, because in places like this there were rules, invisible but absolute, and one of them was that people like Nia did not cross people like Charlotte. And yet here she was, not stepping back, not apologizing, not disappearing the way she had trained herself to do in every other moment of her working life, but standing there, her chest rising and falling, her eyes steady, her fingers trembling just enough to remind her she was still human, still aware of what she had just done. And somewhere near the back of the room a chair scraped quietly against polished wood, a subtle movement, but one that carried a different kind of weight, because the people who noticed it stopped whispering first, and the ones who followed their gaze went silent next. And like a tide pulling away from shore, attention shifted not away from Nia but beyond her, to the man who had just stood up, slowly, deliberately, as if time moved differently for him, as if nothing in this room could truly surprise him, and yet everything in the room now waited on what he would do next. Alexander Romano did not raise his voice, he did not rush forward, he simply stepped out from his seat, the faint glint of his watch catching the warm overhead light, his expression unreadable, not anger, not confusion, something colder, something measured. And as he moved, the space around him seemed to open on instinct. Chairs angled, bodies turned, conversations died before they could form, because everyone understood without needing to be told that whatever had just happened between the waitress and his fiancée was no longer just a moment, it was now a decision, and the consequences of that decision belonged to him and him alone. And still Nia did not move. She felt it, of course, the shift in the room, the way the air itself seemed to tighten, as if holding its breath, waiting for judgment. But she did not look away, not from Charlotte, not from the truth of what had led her here, even as her mind raced, even as every instinct she had ever learned whispered that this was the moment to step back, to apologize, to make herself small again. She stayed exactly where she was, because something in her had already crossed that line long before her hand ever rose. And in the silence that followed, heavy and absolute, the kind that presses against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat, Alexander stopped just a few feet away, and for the first time since the sound had cut through the room his eyes lifted, not to Charlotte, not to the crowd, but to Nia Brooks, and the world seemed to narrow to that single point of focus, as if everything else had been stripped away, leaving only the question that no one dared to ask out loud. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, before any explanation could reshape what had already been done, one thing became undeniable: the night was no longer about status or power or expectation, it was about truth, and whatever happened next would decide who in that room truly understood the cost of dignity. 20 minutes earlier the room had not been silent, it had been alive with the soft rhythm of polished conversation, the kind that flowed easily between people who had never had to question whether they belonged. And Nia Brooks had moved through it like she always did, unnoticed but necessary, her tray balanced steady in her hands, her steps measured, not too fast, not too slow, because in places like this even movement had a standard, and she had learned it the hard way over months of long shifts and quiet corrections, and the subtle glances that told her when she was almost but not quite invisible enough. And from across the room she had noticed them the moment they were seated, not because they were louder than anyone else but because everything around them seemed to adjust slightly, as if the space itself recognized their importance. Charlotte Whitmore did not need to raise her voice to command attention, she carried it with her in the way she sat, in the way she placed her handbag on the table, as if it belonged there more than anything else. And when Nia approached to take their order, Charlotte had barely looked up, her eyes passing over Nia like a reflection in glass, something seen but not acknowledged. And Nia had done what she always did, she smiled politely, she spoke clearly, she wrote down each request with care because professionalism was her shield. It was the one thing no one could take from her as long as she held on to it tightly enough. But there had been a tone in Charlotte's voice, not loud, not openly cruel, just sharp enough to cut through the surface of courtesy, little corrections that were not corrections at all, repeating Nia words back with exaggerated precision, as if testing them, as if questioning whether they belonged in a place like this. And each time Nia had nodded. Each time she had adjusted her posture, her voice, her presence shrinking by inches that no one else would notice, because that was the rule: adapt or disappear. And for a while at work the evening continued. Plates were served, glasses refilled, conversations resumed. And Nia allowed herself to believe that the tension had passed, that whatever edge had been there would remain unspoken. But then came the second order, not food, not drink, but something smaller, something easier to dismiss. Charlotte asked a question about the wine list, a detail that did not matter, but the way she asked it carried something heavier. A pause after Nia answer, a slight tilt of the head, a look exchanged with the others at the table that lasted just long enough to be felt, but not long enough to be called out. And when Nia clarified politely, Charlotte smiled, not kindly, not warmly, but with a softness that felt practiced, and said, "That is not quite what I meant, is it?" And the table chuckled quietly, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to remind Nia exactly where she stood. And still she held her composure, because she had learned that reacting only gave people more to take from you. And so she stepped back, she thanked them, she moved on to the next table, her hand steady, even as something inside her tightened just a little more. But Charlotte was not finished. Some people are like that, they do not need a reason to continue, they only need the space to do it. And when Nia returned again, this time with their entrees, Charlotte's attention shifted back to her with a focus that felt deliberate, her eyes tracing the name tag pinned to Nia uniform, her lips forming the name slowly as if testing it for the first time. Nia Brooks, she repeated, and then she asked, "Where are you from?" Not in the way someone asks out of curiosity, but in the way someone asks when they have already decided what the answer means. And Nia responded the same way she always did, calmly, simply, without offering more than necessary. But Charlotte did not accept the answer. She leaned slightly forward, her voice lowering just enough to create the illusion of intimacy while ensuring everyone at the table could still hear it clearly, and said, "No, I mean, where are you really from?" And the words hung there, not shouted, not aggressive, just placed carefully in the space between them, like something fragile that no one would dare challenge. And for a second Nia felt it, that familiar pressure, the expectation to laugh it off, to respond in a way that would keep everything smooth, to protect the comfort of people who would forget her the moment she walked away. And she almost did, she almost smiled, she almost let it pass like she had done so many times before. But then Charlotte reached for the glass of water Nia had just set down, and with a casual motion that looked like nothing more than a slight miscalculation, tilted it just enough that a thin stream spilled across the edge of the table and onto Nia's hand. And Charlotte pulled back immediately, her expression shifting into something that resembled surprise but did not quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I am so sorry," she said, though the apology felt rehearsed and light. And the table watched, waiting to see how Nia would respond, because this was the moment, the test, the quiet line that determined whether she would remain exactly what they expected or something else entirely. And Nia stood there, the cool water seeping into her sleeve, her fingers tightening just slightly around the edge of the tray. And for the first time that night she did not move to fix it, she did not apologize for something that was not her fault, she did not step back into the role that had been assigned to her. Instead she looked at Charlotte directly, really looked at her, and something in that gaze shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to fully understand, but enough that the next moment would no longer belong to the same version of the evening that had begun 20 minutes before. Charlotte did not pull her hand back immediately, not fully. Instead she let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone at the table to feel it, to notice the way Nia had not moved, the way the usual rhythm of service had broken in a way that could not be smoothed over with a polite smile or a quick apology. And for the first time that evening Charlotte studied her not as a passing presence but as something that had resisted expectation, and that alone seemed to irritate her more than anything else, because people like Charlotte were not used to resistance, especially not from someone who was supposed to remain invisible. And so her smile shifted subtly, still elegant, still composed, but now carrying a sharper edge, as if she had decided that the moment required correction rather than dismissal. And she leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing her legs with effortless precision, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as she glanced at the small damp mark on Nia's sleeve, and then back up to her face, and said, "You should be more careful with that tone." Calm, measured, almost conversational, and yet every word carried an implication that reached beyond the surface, as if the spill had been Nia felt all along as if the imbalance between them needed to be restored immediately, and around them the table remained quiet, not out of respect but out of anticipation, because this was the part where the script usually corrected itself, where the waitress would lower her eyes, apologize and retreat, allowing everything to return to its proper place, and for a fraction of a second the weight of that expectation pressed down on Nia, the familiar voice in her mind reminding her of rent due at the end of the month, of shifts she could not afford to lose, of the countless times she had chosen silence because it was safer, because it was easier, because it was necessary, and she felt her fingers relax slightly, her grip on the tray loosening as if her body itself was preparing to follow that same pattern once again. But then Charlotte spoke again, this time softer but clearer, as if she wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding. You people always think you can just step into places like this and act however you want, and the words were not loud, they did not echo across the room, but they landed with a weight that was unmistakable, because it was not just about tone or service or a glass of water, it was about something deeper, something that had been building long before this night, something that had been said in different ways by different people in different places, and suddenly the room felt smaller, not physically but emotionally, as if the space between Nia and the table had narrowed into something sharper, something that demanded a response whether she wanted to give one or not. And for the first time since she started working there, Nia did not look down, she did not adjust her posture or soften her voice. Instead she held Charlotte's gaze steady, her heartbeat loud in her ears, her thoughts moving faster than she could fully process, because this was no longer just about getting through a shift or avoiding conflict, this was about something she had been carrying for years, something that had never quite found a moment to surface until now, and Charlotte seemed to sense it, the shift in energy, the refusal to comply, and it only encouraged her further, because people who rely on control often push harder when they feel it slipping. And she let out a small breath, almost amused, as she added, I suppose it is easy to forget where you belong when someone hands you a uniform and calls it a career. And there it was, the line, not shouted, not dramatic, but precise enough to cut through everything else, the kind of statement that did not need volume because its intent was already clear. And around the table a few of the guests shifted slightly, not in disagreement but in discomfort, the kind that comes when something crosses into territory that cannot be easily ignored. And yet no one spoke, no one interrupted, because doing so would require choosing a side, and that was a risk none of them were willing to take in a room like this. And Nia felt it, the weight of their silence, the way it confirmed what Charlotte had just said without needing to repeat it, and for a moment time seemed to slow, not in the dramatic sense but in the quiet internal way where every decision stretches just long enough to be fully understood before it is made. And she realized then that there were only two paths forward, one she knew well, the other she had never taken, and the difference between them was not just consequence, it was identity, because one would allow the night to continue as expected and the other would change something that could not be undone. And as Charlotte reached again for her glass, this time with deliberate control, as if reclaiming the moment as her own, Nia made a choice, not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of something steadier, something that had been forming long before this night. And when she spoke her voice was calm, not raised, not sharp, just clear enough to carry across the space between them. I did not forget where I belong. And the simplicity of the words seemed to catch Charlotte off guard for just a second, not because they were loud or confrontational but because they did not follow the script. And in that second the balance shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that what happened next would no longer be controlled by expectation alone. Charlotte blinked once slowly, as if recalibrating, not because she had been challenged in any obvious way but because the response she had just received did not align with any pattern she recognized. And for someone who had spent her entire life navigating rooms like this with effortless control, that unfamiliarity was more unsettling than open defiance could ever be. And the faint smile that had rested on her lips did not disappear, but it shifted, tightening at the edges, becoming something more deliberate, more calculated, as she leaned forward slightly, her fingers brushing against the stem of her glass with a quiet precision that mirrored the way she chose her words. And when she spoke again her voice carried a softness that might have sounded kind to anyone who did not understand the weight beneath it. You misunderstand me, she said, tilting her head just enough to suggest patience, as if she were correcting a simple mistake rather than addressing a boundary that had just been drawn. I am not questioning where you think you belong, I am reminding you how this works. And the distinction hung in the air, subtle but sharp, because it was not about opinion, it was about hierarchy, about the unspoken rules that governed spaces like this, and the expectation that those rules would be accepted without resistance. And for a moment the table seemed to exhale, quietly reassured by the return of something familiar, something structured, because Charlotte was restoring order in the only way she knew how, by reframing the situation as a misunderstanding rather than a challenge, and under normal circumstances that would have Then enough the moment would have softened, the edges would have blurred, and Nia would have stepped back into the role assigned to her, but something had already shifted too far for that to happen, and Charlotte seemed to sense it even if she could not fully define it, because her eyes lingered on Nia longer than before, searching perhaps for hesitation, for uncertainty, for any sign that the balance could still be corrected, and when she did not find it, her tone changed just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice but enough to reveal the intention behind her words. "You are here to serve," she continued gently, as if stating a fact rather than issuing a command, "and there is nothing wrong with that as long as you remember it," and the sentence was delivered with such calm assurance that it might have passed as reasonable if not for the way it landed, because it was not guidance, it was a boundary being reinforced, a line being redrawn in the exact place it had always been expected to exist, and Nia felt it clearly now, not as a sudden realization but as something that had been building piece by piece throughout the evening, each comment, each look, each small moment adding weight until it became impossible to ignore, and for the first time she understood that this was not about a single interaction or even a single person, it was about a pattern that repeated itself in different forms in different places, always with the same expectation that she would accept it quietly and move on, and for years she had done exactly that, because it had been necessary, because it had kept her employed, because it had allowed her to survive in spaces that were not built for her. But standing there now with Charlotte watching her, with the room holding its breath just enough to feel the tension but not enough to intervene, she realized that necessity and acceptance were not the same thing, and that difference mattered more than she had ever allowed herself to admit. And Charlotte, perhaps sensing that the conversation was no longer following the direction she intended, let out a small controlled breath, her fingers tightening briefly around the glass before she set it down with a soft deliberate motion, as if placing a period at the end of a sentence she expected to be final, and then she smiled again, this time brighter, more polished, the version of herself that others recognized, that reassured them that everything was still under control. And she glanced briefly at the others at the table, acknowledging them without words before turning back to Nia and saying, "We do not need to make this uncomfortable, do we?" Her tone lied, almost friendly, but the question itself carried an expectation not of an answer but of compliance, because in her world discomfort was something that could be smoothed over with the right words, the right posture, the right reminder of how things were supposed to work. And for a second the room seemed to lean in, not physically but emotionally, as if waiting for the moment to resolve itself in the only way it ever had before, with the quiet restoration of order. And Nia felt that pressure again, the familiar pull toward silence, toward ease, toward the path that would allow everything to continue without disruption. And she knew she could take it, she knew she could nod, she could apologize, she could step back, and no one would question it, no one would remember this moment beyond a passing discomfort that would fade by the time dessert was served. But she also knew that if she did, nothing would change, not here, not anywhere, not for her, and that knowledge settled in her chest, not heavy, not overwhelming, but clear and steady, like something that had finally found its place. And when she looked at Charlotte again, there was no hesitation in her expression, no uncertainty in her posture, just a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained. And in that stillness something invisible but undeniable shifted between them, because for the first time Charlotte was no longer speaking to someone who would automatically yield, and even if the rest of the room had not yet realized it, the balance had already begun to change in a way that could not be undone. Charlotte held her smile a second longer than necessary, and in that extra moment something beneath it flickered, not uncertainty, not yet, but irritation, restrained carefully behind polished composure, because she was not used to conversations that did not bend back toward her. And the stillness in Nia's response, the absence of apology, the quiet refusal to step away, disrupted more than just the flow of the evening, it disrupted expectation itself. And Charlotte had built her entire presence on the certainty of how people would respond to her, and so she adjusted again, not outwardly, not in any way that would draw attention, but internally, shifting strategies the way someone does when the first approach does not land as intended. And she let out a small breath, soft enough to pass as patience, and reached for her napkin, dabbing at the edge of the table where the faint trace of water had already begun to disappear, as if erasing evidence of something that should never have mattered in the first place. And then she looked back at Nia, this time with a clarity that carried less pretense and more intention, and said, "I think you are forgetting who you are speaking to." And the words were not raised, they did not demand attention from the rest of the room, but they landed with precision, because they were not meant to invite discussion, they were meant to end it, to re-establish control in the simplest way possible, by reminding Nia of the imbalance that had always existed between them. And for a brief second the room seemed to settle again, as if this was the moment everything would return to its expected shape, because this was the language people understood, this was the structure they relied on to maintain the illusion of order, and Nia felt it too, the weight of that statement, the history behind it, the countless times similar words had been spoken in different forms by different voices, always carrying the same message, and she could have accepted it, she could have let it pass the way she always had before, but something in her had already moved beyond that point, something that could not be undone simply by pretending it had not happened, and when she spoke, her voice remained steady, not confrontational. Not loud, just clear enough to exist without permission. I know exactly who I am speaking to, and the response did not escalate the tension in the way the room expected. It did not create a scene or invite reaction, it simply held its ground, and that in itself was enough to shift the energy once more, because now it was no longer just about Charlotte words, it was about Nia's refusal to be defined by them, and Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to openly acknowledge, but enough to signal that the balance she had relied on was no longer as stable as she believed, and for the first time that evening she did not immediately respond. She paused, measuring the situation, recalculating the outcome, because this was no longer a simple interaction, it was becoming something else, something less predictable, and that unpredictability was something she did not tolerate easily, and so she leaned back again, her posture composed, her expression smoothing into something colder, less performative and more direct, and she glanced briefly toward the others at the table as if to confirm that they were still aligned with her, still part of the same unspoken agreement that governed spaces like this, and they were there. Silence confirmed it, their stillness reinforced it, because no one was willing to disrupt the structure that benefited them, and that silence was perhaps the loudest thing in the room, because it made clear that whatever happened next would happen without interference, and Charlotte seemed to take that as permission, because when she turned back to Nia her voice had lost the softness, entirely replaced by something sharper, something that no longer needed to disguise itself as politeness. Then perhaps you should act like it, she said, and the sentence did not linger, it did not stretch into something larger, it simply settled between them, final in its intent, because it was not meant to be debated, it was meant to close the conversation, to push Nia back into the role she had stepped out of, and for a moment everything paused again, not dramatically but in that subtle way where the next action feels inevitable even before it occurs, and Nia stood there feeling the weight of it all, the room, the silence, the expectations pressing in from every direction, and she understood fully now what this moment represented, not just a single interaction, not just a difficult customer, but a choice between continuing to accept what had always been or stepping into something uncertain, something that carried risk, but also something that felt closer to truth than anything she had allowed herself before, and the realization did not come with anger, it did not surge through her in a way that demanded immediate reaction. Instead, it settled quietly, firmly, like a decision that had already been made long before she had the words to express it, and as Charlotte reached again for her glass, this time with deliberate control, her fingers wrapping around it with a certainty that suggested she believed the moment had already been resolved, that the outcome had already been decided, Nia did not step back, she did not lower her gaze, she simply stood there, grounded in a way that felt unfamiliar but undeniable, and in that stillness just before everything shifted, the room remained unaware of how close it was to witnessing something it would not easily forget. Charlotte lifted the glass with slow, deliberate precision, as if the entire moment had already been resolved in her favor, as if the silence around them confirmed what she had always known, that the world would correct itself eventually and return to its proper order, and for a brief second it almost worked, because the room responded in the way it had been trained to respond. Shoulders relaxed slightly, conversations at distant tables threatened to resume, the faint sound of cutlery against porcelain began to return like a cautious breath after tension, and yet at the center of it all nothing had truly shifted, because Nia Brooks did not move, she did not retreat, she did not reach for a cloth to clean the table or offer another apology to smooth over what had been done, and that absence of action became its own presence, something subtle but undeniable, like a note in a song that refuses to resolve, and Charlotte felt it even if she did not fully understand it, because her fingers tightened just slightly around the stem of the glass, the smallest fracture in an otherwise flawless composure, and she lowered it back onto the table without taking a sip, the gesture controlled but incomplete, as if something had interrupted the natural flow of her intention, and her eyes lifted again, meeting Nia with a sharper focus now, not searching, not questioning, but assessing, because this was no longer a misunderstanding, it was a refusal, and refusals were not something she encountered often, and certainly not from someone in Nia's position, and so her voice when she spoke again carried none of the earlier softness, none of the practiced elegance, it was quieter, colder, more direct enough, she said the word landing without force, yet carrying weight, because it was not a plea, it was a command, the kind that expected immediate compliance, the kind that assumed it would be obeyed without hesitation, and for a moment the room responded accordingly, the stillness tightening once more as if bracing for the inevitable correction, the restoration of order that always followed such A tone, and Nia heard it clearly, the final attempt to close the moment, to push her back into silence, to erase everything that had just begun to surface, and for a second her breath caught, not out of fear but out of awareness, because she understood now exactly what was being asked of her, not in words but in expectation. She was being asked to disappear again, to step back into a role that required her to accept whatever was given to her without question, and to do it gracefully in a way that made everyone else comfortable, and she could do it. She had done it countless times before. She knew the exact expression to wear, the exact tone to use, the exact way to lower her eyes just enough to signal submission without drawing attention, and the familiarity of it almost pulled her and almost convinced her that this was the easier path, the safer path, the path that would allow the night to continue without consequence. But then something else surfaced, something quieter but stronger, a memory not of a single moment but of many small ones layered over time. The way people had spoken to her without seeing her, the way she had smiled through discomfort because it was expected, the way she had told herself that it did not matter as long as she kept moving forward, and for the first time she realized that it had always mattered, that each of those moments had shaped something inside her that could no longer be ignored, and that realization settled into her posture, into the way she held herself, into the steadiness of her voice when she finally spoke again, not loud, not confrontational, but undeniable. "I am doing my job," she said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a clarity that cut through everything else, because they were not an apology, they were not an excuse, they were a statement of fact. And for a brief second Charlotte did not respond, not because she did not have something to say, but because the response she expected had not come, and that absence created a space, one that neither of them had anticipated, and in that space the balance shifted again, not dramatically, not enough for the entire room to notice, but enough that those closest to the table felt it. The subtle change in energy, the sense that something was unfolding outside the boundaries they were used to, and Charlotte's expression hardened just slightly, the polished edges giving way to something more controlled, more deliberate, as she leaned forward, her gaze locking onto Nia with a focus that no longer attempted to disguise itself, and said, "Then do it properly." And the words were sharper now, no longer wrapped in politeness, no longer softened for appearance, because the need to maintain control had overridden the need to appear gracious, and around them the room held its breath once more, caught between expectation and uncertainty, because this was the point where something had to give, where the moment would either collapse back into familiarity or break into something entirely different. And Nia stood there feeling the weight of that decision, not as pressure but as clarity, because she knew now that there was no returning to what had been before, not after what had already been said, not after what she had allowed herself to recognize. And as Charlotte's hand moved again toward the glass, this time with a certainty that suggested she believed the outcome was still hers to determine, Nia made the choice that would carry everything forward, not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of a quiet, unshakable understanding that some lines once crossed do not allow you to go back. And in that fraction of a second just before the moment reached its breaking point, the entire room remained suspended on the edge of something it did not yet realize it was about to witness. The moment did not explode, it crystallized, as if time itself chose to slow down rather than shatter. And in that suspended breath between intention and action, Nia Brooks felt something settle inside her, not anger, not fear, but a clarity so quiet it almost felt like calm. And across from her, Charlotte Whitmore's fingers closed fully around the glass, this time lifting it with a smooth, practiced motion, her wrist turning slightly as she brought it closer to her lips, not hurried, not aggressive, but deliberate, as if reclaiming control through something as simple as a sip. And it was in that exact movement that the decision completed itself, because it was no longer about what had been said or what might still be said, it was about what had already been understood. And without raising her voice, without stepping forward in any dramatic way, Nia moved her hand just enough, not forceful, not rushed, but precise, and the glass tilted slightly in Charlotte's grasp, not falling, not breaking, just shifting enough that the illusion of control slipped with it. And Charlotte's eyes widened, not in fear but in disbelief, as she lowered the glass back onto the table, the liquid inside unsettled but contained. And for a fraction of a second neither of them spoke, because the action itself had already said everything that needed to be said. And around them the room reacted, not loudly, not immediately, but in that subtle ripple of awareness that travels faster than sound. Heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence, the pianist's hands hovered above the keys without pressing them, and somewhere near the entrance a server froze in place, as if unsure whether to continue or disappear. And at the center of it all, Charlotte straightened slowly, her posture immaculate, her composure returning in layers as she processed what had just occurred. And when she spoke, her voice was still controlled but now carried something sharper, something less certain than before. "You will regret that," she said, the words measured but no longer effortless, because they were not backed by the same unchallenged authority they had held just minutes earlier. And Nia did not respond immediately. She did not need to, because the moment was no longer defined by words, and when she finally spoke her voice remained even steady, grounded in a way that surprised even her. I did not do anything to regret, and the simplicity of it, the refusal to escalate, the absence of apology shifted the weight of the scene in a way that no raised voice ever could, and for the first time that evening Charlotte did not have an immediate answer. She looked at Nia, not through her, not past her, but at her, as if trying to reconcile the person standing in front of her with the role she had already assigned, and finding that the two no longer aligned, and that disconnect unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant the situation was no longer predictable, and unpredictability in a room like this was dangerous, not physically but socially, because it threatened the structure that everyone relied on to maintain order. And around them the silence deepened, not empty but full of attention, every glance, every breath, every subtle movement drawn toward the table where something had shifted beyond easy explanation. And then from just behind Charlotte a chair moved, not abruptly, not loudly, but with a presence that carried weight beyond the sound itself, and the ripple of attention that had already formed tightened instantly, focusing not just on the table but on the man who had just stepped forward into the space between expectation and consequence. Alexander Romano did not speak immediately. He did not rush to Charlotte's side or raise his voice in defense. Instead, he simply stood there, his gaze moving once from Charlotte to the glass to Nia, and in that single measured glance something passed through his expression, not visible enough to name but undeniable in its effect, because the room responded to it instinctively. Conversations that had almost resumed fell silent again. Shoulders straightened, eyes shifted away and then back, as if no one wanted to miss what would come next, and Charlotte turned toward him, her posture adjusting, her expression softening just slightly, as if expecting alignment, as if certain that whatever had just happened would now be corrected by the one person in the room whose authority mattered most. And for a moment everything held suspended in that expectation, the air itself seeming to pause, as if waiting for a decision that would define not just the outcome of the evening but the balance of power within it. And Nia felt it clearly now, the weight of his presence, the significance of his silence, the understanding that whatever he chose to do next would carry more impact than anything that had happened before. And yet she did not look away, she did not step back, she remained exactly where she was, her posture steady, her gaze calm, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. And in that presence there was something that could not be dismissed, something that no longer fit within the boundaries that had been drawn for her. And as Alexander Romano finally lifted his eyes fully to meet hers, the room seemed to narrow once again to that single exchange, and in that quiet unspoken moment, before any words were spoken, before any action was taken, it became clear that whatever happened next would not follow the script anyone had expected. Alexander Romano did not rush the moment, he let it unfold the way a man does when he understands that time itself can be a form of control. And as his gaze settled on Nia Brooks, there was no immediate judgment in it, no visible anger, no performative reaction that the room could easily interpret, and that absence of reaction was more unsettling than anything else, because people in that room understood power not through noise but through restraint, and the fact that he did not speak right away meant that whatever he chose to say would not be casual. And Charlotte felt it before anyone else, her posture straightening just slightly, her expression shifting from composed irritation to something more calculated, more careful, as if she were already adjusting her position within a situation that was no longer entirely hers to direct. Alexander, she said softly, her voice carrying a note that had not been present before, something closer to expectation than certainty, as if reminding him without words of where his loyalty was supposed to fall. And for a brief second the room seemed to lean in collectively, not physically but in attention, every eye fixed on him, waiting for the alignment that would restore the familiar structure of authority and consequence. But Alexander did not look at Charlotte when she spoke, not immediately. His focus remained on Nia, his expression unchanged, his silence deliberate, and in that silence there was a question not spoken but understood, something he was measuring, not the action itself but the reason behind it, because men like him did not react to moments, they evaluated them. And Nia felt it, the weight of that evaluation, not as pressure but as recognition, because for the first time that evening someone was not simply looking at what she had done, they were looking at why, and that difference shifted something fundamental in the space between them. And when Alexander finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, not raised yet, carrying across the table with absolute clarity what happened. And the question was not directed at Charlotte, it was directed at Nia, and that alone was enough to ripple through the room, because it broke expectation in the simplest way possible by choosing a different point of focus. And Charlotte noticed it instantly, the slight delay in his acknowledgement, the direction of his attention. And it unsettled her more than she allowed herself to show because it suggested that the narrative she had assumed was already forming was not yet fixed, and so she answered quickly before Nia could speak, her tone smooth, composed, almost reassuring. She overstepped. She said the words precise, carefully framed as if presenting a conclusion rather than an account, and for a moment it seemed as though the room might accept that version of events because it was easy, it required no further examination, no shift in perspective. But Alexander did not respond to Charlotte immediately. He did not nod or confirm her statement. Instead his eyes remained on Nia, waiting, and in that waiting there was a quiet insistence that could not be ignored, and Nia understood it not as pressure but as an invitation to speak, something she had not been offered before in this room, and for a brief second the weight of that opportunity settled in her chest, because this was not just about defending herself, this was about choosing whether to step fully into the truth she had already begun to claim. And when she spoke her voice was steady, not rehearsed, not embellished, just clear enough to exist without permission. She was disrespectful, and the simplicity of the statement, the absence of dramatics or justification, gave it a weight that filled the space more completely than any elaborate explanation could have, and the room responded to it not with sound but with stillness, because now there were two versions of the moment existing side by side, one polished, one plain, and neither could be ignored. And Alexander's gaze did not waver. He held it on Nia for a second longer, as if confirming something only he could see, and then slowly he turned his attention to Charlotte, and the shift was subtle but unmistakable, because the warmth she had expected, the automatic alignment she had relied on, did not appear. Instead there was a pause, a fraction of a second where nothing was said and everything was understood, and Charlotte felt that the ground beneath her certainty no longer as solid as it had been just moments ago, and for the first time that evening her composure required effort, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table as she held his gaze, and in that quiet, fragile space where expectation had not yet been fulfilled, the entire room seemed to recognize that whatever came next would not follow the pattern they had anticipated, and that realization settled over them like a hush deeper than silence, because it carried with it the understanding that power, when questioned, does not always respond the way people expect it to. Charlotte held his gaze for a second longer than comfort allowed, and in that second something subtle but undeniable shifted beneath the surface of her composure. Not enough to break it, not enough for anyone to openly acknowledge, but enough to introduce the first trace of uncertainty into a presence that had previously seemed untouchable. And she recovered quickly. Of course she always did. Her posture remained flawless, her expression controlled, her voice when she spoke again measured and precise, as if nothing had changed at all. She is a waitress, she said calmly, as though the statement itself explained everything, as though the role alone justified the expectation that had been placed upon Nia. And for a brief moment the room almost accepted it, because it was familiar, because it required no adjustment in perspective, because it allowed everyone present to return to the comfort of what they already believed. And yet Alexander did not respond, not immediately. His silence stretched just long enough to make that explanation feel incomplete, and when he finally spoke his tone remained even, almost quiet, but there was something in it that carried weight beyond the words. "And what does that mean?" he asked, and the question did not challenge her directly, it did not accuse or confront, but it removed the foundation from beneath her statement, leaving it exposed in a way that could no longer rely on assumption alone. And Charlotte felt it, the shift, the way the room no longer moved with her as easily as it had just moments ago, and for the first time her response required more than instinct. She paused just briefly, just enough to reveal that she was recalculating, and then she smiled again, softer this time but less certain. "It means she should know her place," and the words landed clearly, no longer disguised, no longer softened, because now they needed to hold their own weight. And around them the silence deepened, not because anyone agreed or disagreed, but because everyone understood exactly what had just been said and what it implied. And Alexander listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, and when he responded there was no rise in his voice, no visible change in his posture, just a slight narrowing of focus that suggested he had reached a conclusion long before he chose to speak. "And whose place is that?" he asked, and this time the question carried something sharper, not louder, not more forceful, but more precise, because it did not allow for an easy answer, it did not allow the moment to return to comfort, it required something more. And Charlotte hesitated, not for long, not enough to appear unsure, but long enough for the room to notice that this was no longer effortless, and she lifted her chin slightly, as if reinforcing her position, as if reminding both him and everyone watching that she belonged to a world where these questions did not need to be answered out loud, because they were already understood. And yet the fact that he had asked it changed everything, because now the Silence around it felt heavier, more deliberate, and in that silence Nia remained still, her presence no longer secondary, no longer fading into the background but existing fully within the space of the conversation without needing to assert itself, and that alone altered the balance in a way that no raised voice ever could. And Charlotte finally spoke again, her tone firmer, now less polished, more direct. People like her do not speak to people like us that way, and the sentence settled between them not as an argument but as a declaration of belief, something she had never needed to question before. And for a moment it seemed as though the room might hold on to that belief as well, because it was easier, because it required nothing from them but acceptance. And then Alexander exhaled softly, not a sigh, not frustration, just a quiet release, as if confirming something internally. And when he spoke again his voice did not change in volume, but it carried a clarity that cut through everything else. That way he repeated, and the simplicity of the phrase shifted the focus entirely, because it did not engage with the hierarchy she had presented, it did not validate or reject it directly, it redirected the moment back to the action itself, back to the behavior that had led them here. And in doing so it stripped away the layers of assumption that had been built around it, and Charlotte felt it immediately, the conversation no longer moving where she intended it to, the control she had maintained beginning to slip, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone could openly call out, but enough that she could no longer rely on the same certainty. And for the first time that evening her composure required effort, not visible to most but undeniable to her. And as the silence settled once more, heavier now, more focused, the entire room seemed to understand that whatever came next would not simply resolve the moment, it would redefine it. Charlotte did not answer immediately, and that silence, unlike the others that had come before it, did not feel controlled, it felt uncertain, as if the space between expectation and reality had widened just enough that she could no longer cross it without effort. And for the first time since the evening began the room did not move with her, it did not lean into her words or settle around her presence, it waited, and that waiting carried weight because it meant that something had shifted beyond her influence. And Alexander Romano stood in that shift without changing his posture, without raising his voice, without offering any visible sign of confrontation, and yet the absence of reaction had become its own form of authority, because it forced everything else to reveal itself without interruption. And Charlotte felt it clearly now, the subtle but undeniable loss of control, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady like a current pulling against her carefully maintained composure. And she inhaled slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding herself in something tangible. And when she spoke again her voice was still composed but no longer effortless. You are making this into something it is not, she said, the words measured, almost gentle, but carrying a tension that had not been there before, as if she were trying to reshape the narrative into something smaller, something easier to contain. And for a moment the room seemed to consider it, because that was always the instinct, to reduce, to simplify, to avoid discomfort by pretending it did not exist. But Alexander did not respond to the statement, he did not engage with the framing, instead his gaze remained steady, and when he spoke his voice was quiet, almost calm enough, he said, and the words did not interrupt, they did not escalate, they simply settled into the space with a finality that made everything else pause. And Charlotte turned toward him fully now, her expression shifting again, searching for alignment, for confirmation, for the restoration of the structure she had relied on. And Alexander met her gaze without hesitation, without softness, without the familiarity she had expected, and in that moment it became clear that whatever she had assumed about his response no longer applied, and the room felt it instantly, the subtle tightening of attention, the way every presence seemed to draw inward as if witnessing something that did not belong to them and yet would affect them all. And Alexander did not speak immediately again, he allowed the silence to stretch just enough to remove any doubt about his intention, and then he said, "We are done here." And the sentence was simple, not dramatic, not raised, but absolute in a way that did not invite interpretation. And Charlotte blinked once, her composure holding, but only just as the meaning of his words settled in, and for a fraction of a second she did not move, she did not respond, because the outcome she had expected had not arrived, and the absence of it created a space she had not prepared for. And when she finally spoke her voice carried a sharpness that broke through the surface of her control. "What do you mean we are done?" she asked, and the question was not just about the moment, it was about everything that had led up to it, everything she believed had been understood. And Alexander did not look away, he did not soften his expression, he simply answered without raising his voice, without adding explanation, "We are leaving." And the words did not carry anger, they did not carry emotion, they carried decision, and that difference changed everything, because there was no argument to be made, no escalation to respond to, only a line that had already been drawn. And Charlotte felt it fully now, the shift, the loss not just of control over the moment but of the narrative she had assumed would define it. And her fingers tightened slightly against the table, her posture still perfect but no longer effortless, and for The first time that evening she looked not at Nia, not at the room, but at Alexander, as if seeing him differently, as if recognizing that whatever authority she believed she held within his world was not as fixed as she had assumed, and around them the silence deepened once more, not empty but filled with realization, because everyone present understood what had just happened, even if no one would say it out loud. The expected order had not been restored, the hierarchy had not been reinforced. Instead, something else had taken its place, something quieter but far more decisive, and in that quiet the balance of the entire room shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to every eye, but undeniably to those who were paying attention, and Nia Brooks stood at the center of it, not because she had demanded attention, not because she had forced the moment, but because she had refused to disappear from it. And as Alexander turned slightly away from the table, his presence still commanding even in the absence of movement, it became clear that the outcome of the evening would not be defined by expectation but by something far less predictable and far more difficult to ignore. Charlotte did not move when he turned away, not immediately, and that hesitation revealed more than any reaction could have, because it was not just surprise, it was disbelief, the kind that comes when something fundamental does not align with expectation. And for the first time that evening her control was no longer seamless, it required effort, it required choice, and that alone shifted the energy of the room in a way that could not be undone. And the silence that followed was no longer passive, it was aware. Every person present understood that what had just happened was not a misunderstanding, not a moment of tension that would fade with time. It was a decision, and decisions made by men like Alexander Romano carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate space, and Charlotte seemed to realize it in pieces, her fingers tightening slightly against the table, her posture remaining upright but no longer relaxed, and when she finally spoke her voice carried a sharp edge that had not been there before. "You are seriously walking away from this?" she asked, and the question was not just directed at him, it was directed at the situation itself, at the shift that had occurred without her consent. And Alexander paused, not turning back immediately, not rushing to respond, and that pause was deliberate. It allowed the weight of her words to settle, to be fully heard before he chose whether or not they mattered. And when he did turn, his gaze met hers evenly, without anger, without hesitation, and without the softness she had expected. "I am walking away from this," he said, and the emphasis was subtle but clear, because it separated the moment from her. It removed her from the center of the decision in a way she had not anticipated, and Charlotte felt at the distinction, the quiet but undeniable boundary that had just been drawn. And for a second her composure faltered, not visibly enough for most to notice, but enough that her breath caught slightly before she spoke again, and this time there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to disguise the frustration beneath it. "This is ridiculous," she said, and the word landed harder than anything she had said before, because it was no longer controlled, it was reactive. It was the first sign that the situation had moved beyond her influence, and the room felt it instantly, the shift from composure to tension, the realization that what was unfolding was no longer contained within the boundaries of polite interaction. And yet Alexander did not respond to the tone, he did not engage with the frustration, he simply looked at her for a moment longer, as if confirming something final, and then he said quietly, "It should have been simple." And the statement was not an accusation, it was not a lecture, it was a reflection of something that had already been decided. And Charlotte's expression changed at that, not dramatically but enough to reveal that she understood the implication, even if she did not agree with it. And for a brief second neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with everything that had not been said, everything that did not need to be said, because the outcome had already been set in motion. And around them the room remained silent, not out of politeness but out of awareness, because everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that did not happen often, something that disrupted the patterns they relied on to navigate spaces like this. And in that silence Nia Brooks remained still, her presence steady, her gaze calm, not because she had anticipated any of this but because she had already made her choice long before the outcome revealed itself. And Alexander turned slightly, then, not fully leaving, not yet, but shifting his attention just enough to acknowledge her presence again, and when he spoke his voice carried none of the tension that had filled the room. It was quieter, almost softer, but no less certain. "Are you all right?" And the question landed differently than anything else that had been said that night, because it was not about hierarchy or expectation, it was not about control or correction, it was about recognition. And for a moment Nia did not answer, not because she did not have a response but because the question itself was unfamiliar in this space, in this context, and she felt it, the weight of it, the sincerity behind it, the absence of assumption. And when she finally nodded, the movement was small but clear. Yes, she said, and the simplicity of the exchange shifted something once more, not in the room, not in the balance of power, but in the space between them, because for the first time that evening the moment was no longer defined by conflict, it was defined by acknowledgement, and Charlotte saw it, she felt it even if she did not fully understand it, the shift in focus, the redirection of attention, and it unsettled her more than anything that had come before, because it confirmed what she had been trying to avoid since the moment began, that this was no longer about control, this was about something she could not dictate. And as the silence settled once more, deeper, now more final, the outcome of the evening became clear, not through dramatic action, not through raised voices, but through the quiet, undeniable realization that the rules everyone had relied on were not as fixed as they believed. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like this did not dissolve the way ordinary tension did. They lingered, they settled into the space between people, into the quiet glances exchanged across tables, into the way conversations resumed a little too carefully, as if everyone was aware that something had shifted and could not quite name what it was, and Nia Brooks felt it even as she turned slightly, her hands still steady, her posture unchanged. She could feel the weight of attention, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present in a way that reminded her that she was no longer invisible in this room, and that realization did not come with pride or fear, it came with something quieter, something more grounded in awareness that what had just happened had altered more than a single interaction, it had changed the way she occupied the space around her, and for a moment she stood there, unsure of what came next, not because she lacked direction, but because for the first time she was not reacting, she was choosing, and that difference created a pause, one that allowed her to breathe, to feel the steadiness in her own voice, the certainty in her own posture. And as she adjusted the tray in her hands, the simple familiar motion felt different, not because the task had changed, but because she had, and across from her Charlotte Whitmore remained seated, her composure restored on the surface but no longer untouched, her expression carefully neutral, her posture still elegant, but the effort behind it now visible in the slight tension of her shoulders, the way her fingers rested too precisely against the edge of the table, as if holding herself in place. And she did not speak again, not to Nia, not to Alexander, not to anyone, because there were no words that could restore what had already shifted, no statement that could return the moment to what it had been, and that silence spoke louder than anything she might have said, because it acknowledged without admitting that control once assumed could be challenged, and that recognition settled into the room like a quiet truth no one needed to voice. And Alexander Romano stood for a second longer, his attention no longer fixed on conflict but on conclusion, as if he had already moved beyond the moment even while standing within it. And when he finally stepped away from the table, it was without urgency, without hesitation, his movement smooth, deliberate, the kind that did not draw attention yet commanded it nonetheless, and the space he left behind felt different, not emptier but clearer, as if something unnecessary had been removed. And in that clarity the room began to breathe again, conversations resumed in low measured tones, glasses were lifted once more, but the rhythm had changed subtly, undeniably, because everyone present had witnessed something that did not fit within the usual patterns of the place, and that awareness lingered beneath every word, every glance, every quiet exchange. And Nia moved then, not quickly, not retreating, but continuing her work as she always had, carrying plates, adjusting settings, responding to requests with the same calm professionalism that had defined her before. But now there was something else within it. Something that could not be unseen or undone, a quiet confidence that did not demand recognition yet altered the way she carried herself through the room, and those who noticed it did not speak of it directly, but they felt it in the way their tone shifted slightly, in the way their expectations adjusted without explanation. And near the edge of the dining area one of the junior servers watched her with a look of quiet astonishment, not because of what had happened but because of how she remained after it, unchanged in her composure yet transformed in something deeper. And as the evening continued, the initial shock faded into something more reflective, something that settled into memory rather than reaction, and for those who had witnessed it the moment would not be remembered as an outburst or a disruption, but as a shift, a subtle redefinition of what could happen when someone chose not to disappear. And in the quiet aftermath of it all, as the last echoes of tension dissolved into the soft hum of the restaurant, Nia Brooks continued moving through the space, not as someone who had broken the rules but as someone who had simply refused to accept them as they were. And in that quiet refusal something lasting had been set into motion, something that did not need to be announced to be understood, because sometimes the most powerful change does not arrive with noise, it arrives with presence, and once it is seen it cannot be unseen. By the time the evening neared its quiet conclusion, the restaurant had returned to its rhythm, at least on the surface. Glasses were cleared, tables reset, the soft glow of overhead lights reflecting off polished surfaces as if nothing had ever disrupted their calm. And yet beneath that familiar cadence something remained, something subtle but lasting, carried in the way people glanced a second longer than usual In the way voices softened when Nia Brooks approached, as if acknowledging without words that the space she moved through was no longer quite the same, and she felt it not as pressure, not as attention that demanded anything from her, but as a quiet shift in how she existed within the room, no longer defined solely by the role she performed but by the presence she carried within it. And she did not dwell on it, she did not pause to analyze what had changed, she simply continued working the way she always had, her movements steady, her voice calm, her focus grounded in the tasks before her. And yet there was something different in the way she held herself, a certainty that did not need to be announced, a balance that no longer depended on the approval of those around her. And near the entrance, a couple who had witnessed the earlier moment exchanged a glance as she passed their table, their conversation pausing briefly, not out of discomfort but out of recognition, because they had seen something they could not easily forget, something that challenged the quiet assumptions they carried into spaces like this. And though they said nothing, the shift in their expression lingered, a silent acknowledgement of what had been witnessed. And at the far end of the room, the pianist resumed playing his melody, smooth and controlled, the notes weaving through the air as if guiding the evening back to its expected close. And yet even in the music there was a subtle difference, a depth that had not been there before, as if the room itself had absorbed the moment and was now carrying it forward in ways too quiet to name. And as the final tables were cleared and the last guests prepared to leave, the atmosphere settled into something softer, something reflective, and Charlotte Whitmore was no longer present, her absence noted not through conversation but through the quiet space she had left behind, a space that no longer demanded attention. And in its place remained only the memory of a moment that had not unfolded as expected. And Alexander Romano did not return to the dining area, he did not re-enter the scene to reclaim it or redefine it, because his decision had already been made and its impact had already been felt. And for those who had witnessed it, that was enough, because the absence of further action only reinforced the finality of what had occurred. And as Nia placed the last set of silverware onto a freshly prepared table, her hands moved with the same precision they always had, but now there was something else within that movement, something that could not be taught or assigned, something that came from within. And as she stepped back to observe the table, ensuring every detail was exactly as it should be, she allowed herself a single quiet breath, not of relief, not of exhaustion, but of recognition, because for the first time she understood that dignity was not something given by others, it was something held, something carried, something that remained even when the world around you expected you to set it down. And in that understanding there was no need for validation, no need for acknowledgement, because the shift had already taken place, not in the room, not in the reactions of those who had watched, but within her. And that was where it mattered most. And as the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the close of the evening, and the final guests made their way toward the exit, the restaurant returned fully to its calm, its polished stillness, its quiet elegance. And yet for those who had been there, for those who had witnessed the moment when expectation had been challenged and silence had been replaced by truth, the memory remained not loud, not dramatic, but clear and lasting. And in that memory there was a simple, undeniable realization that lingered long after the doors had closed and the night had settled into stillness, that dignity does not ask for permission, and when it stands its ground even the most powerful rooms must learn to recognize it.